Gladiators were the idols of the Roman common people. Their fights were rare and were a favorite spectacle, attracting masses of spectators. During the crisis of the Roman Republic, gladiatorial duels moved from the arena to the city streets and squares of Rome, and circus athletes turned into gangs of thugs in the service of the ambitious. Initially, gladiatorial games were organized on the initiative of private individuals who, wishing to present to the public the fight of specially trained fighters, turned to the help of businessmen intermediaries. These latter were engaged in the fact that at their own risk bought on the market prisoners of war and young slaves with suitable physical data, which enclosed schools trained in the art of fencing special teachers. In the future, the fighters were handed over for a lot of money to the organizers of games. If the gladiators managed to survive the performance, they returned to their master. Most of them died sooner or later. Some lucky ones managed to get freedom or to reach the position of a fencing teacher. As the popularity of the spectacle grew, the number of gladiatorial schools and the number of fighters trained in them increased. Some of them are known to us by the names of their owners. For example, in Rome there was a gladiatorial school owned by a certain Aurelius Scaurus, and in Capua there was the school of Lentulus Bodyguards, where Spartacus' rebellion began. According to Plutarch, this school trained at least 200 fighters, most of whom were Gauls and Thracians. The success of gladiatorial games among the common people stimulated applicants for public office to organize appropriate spectacles to increase their popularity among the electorate. First of all, it concerned candidates for the position of aedile, which began the political career of noble Romans. The duty of aediles was to organize theatrical and circus performances, in addition to which they promised the voters to organize gladiatorial duels. The organization and conduct of the games could cost the organizer a fortune. Julius Caesar, during his aedilitate, had to bring into the arena a record 320 pairs of fighters fighting in silver armor to beat the competition. This number so frightened the Senate that it legislated to limit the number of gladiators that could be owned by a private citizen. But Caesar games won the unconditional love of the common people, which he enjoyed until the end of his days. Already victorious in the Civil War, Caesar presented to the Roman public an amazing spectacle of the battle of 2 regiments of 500 infantry, 300 horsemen and 20 war elephants in each. However, in some cases, the known generosity or special abilities of the candidate could serve him bad service. Sulla, who sought the office of praetor, lost the election. Restrictive regulations of the Senate had serious grounds. It was not simply a matter of manipulating public opinion. In the last decades of the Republic, ambitious and determined politicians began to acquire a kind of bodyguard squads from among the gladiators to achieve political goals by force in extreme cases. The threat of pressure on the state with the help of these units, the Senate clearly felt during the conspiracy of Lucius Sergius Catilina. The conspiracy involved many members of the nobility, including, according to some reports, even Caesar. The conspirators staked on political terror. They were able to gather between 7,000 and 20,000 followers, which included veterans, impoverished peasants and shepherds. Fearing civil strife in Rome itself, the Senate decided to expel from the city and send to Campania all the gladiators available at the time. A certain Gaius Marcellus in the same year was expelled from Capua for trying to recruit gladiators with whom he was going to come to the aid of Catiline. The worst fears of the Senate were confirmed during the new riots that swept Rome. Violence in the Forum during elections and during the adoption of laws became the norm. Leaders of rival parties created entire assault squads, which they used to intimidate their enemies and disrupt meetings. The leader of the Populares, Publius Clodius Pulchris, usually relied on his plebeian supporters. His opponent Titus Annius Milon used gladiators to oppose him. The two leaders met by chance on the outskirts of Rome on the Appian Way. Clodius, returning from a country estate, was on horseback, accompanied by 2 or 3 friends and about 30 slaves armed with swords. By contrast, Milon, on his way from Rome, rode in a wagon with his wife, followed by a large crowd of slaves, including gladiators. As the two retinues passed each other in silence, one of Milon's men started a quarrel with Clodius' slaves. He returned to see what the commotion was about, and at that moment he was stabbed in the back with a dagger. There was a disorderly scuffle on the road. Clodius, bleeding, was carried by his men to a roadside inn. Milon came here and ordered his gladiators to finish off the wounded man. His body, covered with wounds, was brought to Rome and burned in the Forum. Excited niggers, and the fire that broke out at this time was destroyed several public buildings. In the era of civil wars, all their participants enlisted gladiators in their armies. The beginning of this practice was laid by Gnaeus Pompey. He granted freedom to the fighters trained at the gladiatorial school in Capua, which belonged to Caesar. There were 5,000 of them, wrote Cicero, as they were said to intend to make a sortie. Pompey had prudently distributed the gladiators among his supporters, giving them 2 each as bodyguards, and thus eliminated the possibility of their military use. The conspirators who assassinated Caesar used the detachments of gladiators they hired to seize power in the capital and neutralize their enemies. Decimus Brutus Albinus included gladiators in his army, with which he withstood the siege of Mark Antony. The latter also had gladiators among his bodyguards, the number of which reached 6,000 people. Gladiators fought in the army of his brother Lucius Antony during the Perusian War against Caesar Octavian and remained loyal to their employer to the end. In the army, gladiators were especially valued for their swordsmanship. A gladiator, who had undergone a course of training, was able to fight with equal dexterity both left and right-handed and possessed the most sophisticated techniques of combat. Some Roman commanders sought to use this experience to train their troops. It is known that the consul Publius Rutilius, going to war against the Cimbrians, instructed Lanists from the gladiatorial school of Aurelius Scaurus to teach his soldiers more complex techniques of striking and repelling blows. However, these attempts were more often than not unsuccessful. Gladiators, like modern athletes, spent all their time in sports training, which was inaccessible to the absolute majority of ordinary soldiers. This difference in the level of training affected the outcome of the battles. Appian notes that during the skirmishes that constantly occurred on the outskirts of the fortifications besieged Perusia, Octavian's soldiers invariably surpassed the enemy in throwing spears. In hand-to-hand combat, victory usually went to the gladiators of Lucius Antony. Head superior to ordinary soldiers in the level of professional skill, gladiators were noticeably inferior to them in other aspects of the military profession. Roman soldiers, as wrote Bagesius, were trained to march in full military equipment and with heavy luggage, dig ditches and ditches, run and swim. The stamina required to perform these actions justified their nickname, Mary's Mules. Gladiators were much inferior to soldiers in these aspects of military training, being professional athletes rather than warriors. From the description of the fighting during the civil war between Vitellius and Othin, it follows that the experience of using units made up of gladiators was rather unsuccessful. Even on the battlefield they were unable to resist the onslaught of regular army soldiers. When during the Marcomannic War the Emperor Marcus Aurelius tried again to include gladiators in the active army, this experience was again unsuccessful. Interestingly, many Roman professional military men were indifferent to gladiatorial games. Gnaeus Pompey, as is known from the words of Cicero, considered them a waste of time. Caesar provoked the censure of the Roman crowd by continuing to work with papers even during the performances. Emperor Tiberius, himself an experienced military man, even reduced the number of spectacles organized and the number of participants. Vespasian was also indifferent to gladiatorial fights, and his son Domitian, when the crowd demanded from him the spectacle, in mockery of her brought to the arena dwarfs.